Welcome to Church Online. Thanks everybody for joining us. My name is Kevin Bates, and if you want to find out more about who we are, go to our website, resonatechristian.church. That's resonatechristian.church. There on that website, you can find out more of who we are, or you can download our app that's now visible on the homepage of our website. Just go to that homepage. If you want to download the app, you can do so there. And there you will be able to get caught up on our material. You'll be able to find out who we are, what we do, and how you can support us. So if you want to connect in a little bit more, find out how to do that on that website and on that app. So we are in part 2 of resilience and looking at staying human in a fractured world. That's the title of this little mini 2-part series that I'm doing, resiliency, and looking at resilience, faith, and basically a way to steady ourselves in chaotic times. I do believe that there are 2 cults that we're dealing with, and cult behavior looks a little bit like what you're hearing, maybe some news feeds that you're hearing on really 2 extreme sides of our political world, where we need to be careful about what we're listening to, what information that we're taking in. Last week, we talked about resiliency in general. We talked about, I used the metaphor of the river and in the movement of life, ups and downs. And then when it starts to flood on either side of the embankment, that's when life gets a little bit out of control. I think when we listen to certain cultish type groups that speak very strongly into our lives, we can experience deregulation and a sense of flooding of information, but also what is right and what is wrong. We lose a sense of that. So we named something really important last week. And that naming was this: we are not broken, we are just adapting. We're not broken, we're just adapting. So instead of saying, what's wrong with me, maybe it's time to say something is happening inside of me, not what's wrong with me, but something is happening inside of me. So today I want to widen our lens a little bit more. I want to look at resilience, not necessarily of what's happening inside of us, but also what's happening around us. So we can have external factors that are creating internal dysregulation. And if we're honest, we're living in a very stressful moment. We're living in a time that certain things are destabilized, and it's not necessarily, and I'm going to be really honest, it's not necessarily we're living in a moment that's not just stressful, which it is stressful, but I would say these moments that we're going through are formational. They're definitely forming who we are and for the rest of our lives, shaping us. So every algorithm, every headline we read, every conversation we have, and every tension we feel or we're standing in the middle of, that's shaping us, that's changing us, that's telling and informing us our identity and who we are. It's also pulling on our nervous system. It's creating basically a dysregulation of our nervous system, informing the way that we are being, showing up, and also responding in the world around us. So at a surface level, I can ask this question: how do I cope with all of that? Right? So how do I deal with that sense of stress? But the next question, today's question, is this: who am I becoming because of this? Who am I becoming because of this? So I'm going to name the moment. I'm going to describe this moment for us and go back to that cult idea here in a minute. We are living in a time, I believe, that fear is amplified, identity is politicized, certainty is rewarded. It's rewarded. Nuance in life is lost, and faith has been shaped into something that looks less like Jesus and more like control. And that's where our Christianity stands. So we see forms of Christianity in that. And the forms of Christianity that divide instead of heal, dominate instead of serve, and react instead of reflect or respond in a Christian way. The challenge that Christians have in this tension, in this time, is the threat of Christian nationalism. Christian nationalism is the top of my list of cult. And what that does is it's very damaging to our Christian faith. What you're hearing in your news cycles, what's being said by leadership, we need to distance ourselves from Christian nationalism. Just in word and just in thought, we need to distance ourselves from it. When you hear war and Jesus being synonymously married in the narrative, that is not gospel. That is not anything close to the gospel. That added layer of challenge to this whole challenge, right? So I'm trying to be this faithful person. I'm trying to be a Christian follower of Jesus. But then that challenge added onto the layer basically threatens what I believe is real. It threatens what is true. It threatens right and wrong. It threatens the gospel that I know and that I believe and that I fell in love with. It threatens the what's godly and promotes actually what is opposite. It promotes what is opposite of that. So it dysregulates who we are in our faith as well. So when you start hearing violence and Jesus in the same sentence supporting one another, war and gospel, the killing of people, enemy and Jesus, right? When you start hearing those things synonymously told or spoken in the narrative, we need to be very careful of that. When you also hear just the total rejection, though, of Christianity because of that, there is Christ in the rubble. And I think that Christ in this rubble, the true Christ, the one Christ that we know as the gospel Christ, I still believe that the gospel of Christ still emerges out of that rubble. The gospel of Christ still stands. That love your neighbor, love God and love your neighbor, clothe the naked, house the houseless, feed the hungry, heal the sick, love your neighbor, welcome the foreigner, taking care of the orphan and the widow. That gospel of Christ, that gospel of Jesus still stands. That is actually the Christ that the Bible promotes and accentuates through the whole New Testament. Jesus, if I just go back to that Jesus, and I focus on the person, that person of Jesus. Jesus lived in a time of religious nationalism. He lived in a time of absolute political tension between forces of the world, absolute political tension. And in that world, Jesus said, "My kingdom is not of this world." So what I'm witnessing today is the kingdom of God is a part of this world, is being synonymously spoken as married to this world. That's the kingdom of God that's being promoted in Christian nationalism. So the kingdom, my kingdom, Jesus says, is not of this world. It's like this tension, this war, this fighting, this political division is here, but this is the kingdom that we belong in here. We are aliens and strangers in this place. So our response to this division, war, and violence, our response to it is much different. It's not worldly. It is of love and care and compassion and grace, which is in the world is opposite, right? In the world, it's quid pro quo. It is I give, I get, or it's you do this, I do the same back, or even worse. It's threatening because you're threatening. It is taking instead of giving. It's not a surplus life. It is a taking life. It's an indebted life versus a surplus life. Over here, the kingdom of God is a surplus life. I give because that's what God calls me to do. That's the person of Jesus in me giving to you. So my kingdom is not of this world. So when faith becomes fused with power and fear and all these things, it stops forming people in love. It actually forms people in division and hate. And it starts forming people in actually just reaction, whatever that reaction is inside of us. So we need a resilience as a spiritual practice. We need resiliency as a spiritual response to the reaction. It's not just a psychological principle I'm promoting, it's deeply spiritual. It's about staying present, it's about staying grounded, it's about staying connected to God in this world of, I guess you could use the word chaos. So when everything around us is trying to pull us into fear and anger, uncertainty and division, what is our response? Romans 12 says, do not conform to the pattern of this world. Do you see the pattern of this world and what it is? It's about greed and power. It's about domination. But we don't conform to that. We conform to something different. Be transformed by the renewing of our mind. Be transformed because of Christ. So the word pattern could be translated to pressure, right? So do not conform to the pressure of this world that's being put upon us. And that's what I think Christian nationalists have succumbed to, is they've succumbed to the pressure that if I marry my politics and religion so closely together that I become almost like a theocratic type speaker, if I succumb to that pressure, then God's will be done. But God's will has been done. And on earth as it is in heaven, we are to behave. And so don't conform to that pressure. Don't conform to that pattern, but be transformed, be shaped by God instead of reacting to the pattern. We respond to the pattern with what? The fruit of the Spirit, loving our neighbor, welcoming the foreigner, and caring for the sick and the needy and the houseless and the hungry. So there's a real battle, I believe, that we're dealing with, and the real battle is not out there. I think it's within me also. That battle of, will I be pulled in? And the more information just transfer, or the more the more inputs I have in my life, the chance of me being pulled into that reactivity is great, and I need to be careful of fasting from information inputs. Will I lose my center? That's another question. I'm centered and grounded in Christ. Will I lose that center? Will I stop seeing people as human? This is something that I was literally trained in classes in adopting children, is looking at the way that I respond, that I react, that I speak to, what I do to others. Am I treating them as an object, or am I treating them as a human? Do I see them as human, or do I see them as objectification? And that is something we need to be very, very careful of, especially in who we perceive as our enemy, because God tells us to love our enemy. So even in the midst of hate and threat and negativity and spoken attack, our response to that is to just love, because obviously there's something wrong. Obviously that person is hurting. Obviously that person is threatened. Obviously that person thinks that they're so right that everyone else around them has to be wrong. That kind of behavior definitely puts me back on my heels. So I need to fight towards basically treating people as human beings, to not dehumanize who they are. Because when my nervous system gets dysregulated, when my nervous system goes haywire in my body, my thinking narrows. As they think that they're right, I think I'm more right. Right. So my system narrows, my empathy decreases. So I stop caring. I actually start hating back. Right. And our fear increases. So then my conspiracies start to come into play. So I have a fear-based response when I get dysregulated. And that's exactly the environment that division thrives in. So I could say that in conclusion to why is this chaos happening around us? Why is there so much division? I think that with social media inputs, news cycle inputs, the headlines and the algorithms that were trapped in these silos that we're in has created an environment of division. We're only receiving a certain amount of information, and that information is designed for likes and for more content. It's designed so that you will look at it and want to look at it more and want to look at other things more. So in media and in that kind of discipline or that kind of job, you're actually creating content that will attract and addict for more content. And so this is where division thrives, is when you are dysregulated and our thinking narrows, our empathy narrows, and our fear then widens and increases. So James tells me this: everyone should be quick to listen, slow to speak, and slow to become angry, because human anger does not produce the righteousness that God deserves. So that's a regulated presence. That's a regulated presence in life. So if you could practice this for a moment, that what do we do, like actually practice in this moment? These are not abstract ideas. These are real practices that you can do in your discipline and how you want to respond to these moments. So we need to practice presence over reactivity. So before we respond, we pause. And maybe there's something else that we can think about. Something is happening inside of me that I don't understand. When this person says this, or when I hear this, this is creating a emotional reaction or a feeling inside of me. I notice my body, I notice my breath, I notice my emotion, maybe that meditative moment where you're thinking something is happening inside of me and I need to pause. That pause is discipline. That is hard to do, and it takes practice. It's not avoidance. It's disciplining our response. And a disciplined response requires pause. So stimulus, pause, then respond. We receive a stimulus, whatever that is. You could just be listening to a news cycle. You could be listening or reading an article in the New York Times. You could be doing whatever you're going to read, or the input creates a stimulus. But before I respond, I need to pause. And in that pause, the idea of being still, knowing God is God, being still, stillness, not being passive, but intentionally not reactive. So I'm going to pause. I'm going to seek guidance in that pause. So what do I need to know more about this story? What do I need to know more about this stimulus, right? And then I need to enter into the second practice. So once I'm in pause, then I can start maybe evaluating or assessing or reassessing what's going on inside of me. If we're going to be formed into light, if we're going to be formed into more of a light, we don't always just need to make sure everyone knows we're right. So light, if you can remember this, light does not necessarily follow right. Light is light. And if we want to be the light of the world, speaking right down people's throats is not necessarily how to get there. It's actually presence. It's actually curiosity over certainty. So I can be certain in my mind. I'm certainly right. I'm certain in my knowing of truth. But if I don't practice curiosity of why that person is responding, reacting, or doing what they're doing, I think people are just not going to listen, or they're not going to respond back. They're just going to hate more. So Jesus consistently asked questions, consistently kept curiosity at the forefront of the mind. And so curiosity keeps our minds open. Curiosity doesn't shut down conversation. Curiosity just asks more questions, asks more reflection. It demands more reflection. So in my stillness, in my pause, if I can then begin the process or the practice of curiosity over certainty, maybe I could understand more. Maybe the ownership then of the stimulus belongs actually to them who is stimulating, right? A lot of times when somebody says something that creates a reaction, we automatically think something's wrong with us. And then we react out of what's wrong with us. So if somebody's yelling at me, I feel shame, something's wrong with me, then I react out of that shame. But if we would reflect a little bit and we would assess a little bit and then remain curious in our questions, right? I don't necessarily like the word curiosity because that just seems a little bit, I guess, I don't know. It seems a little bit like, in the clouds. I'm just going to remain curious, right? When we know what's right and wrong and we know what's true and false in certain things, but the curiosity is not necessarily in the true or false. The curiosity is more into why is this being said, or what is actually being said, and what are the motivations about what is being said. Many times it is about what is right and wrong, or true and false, and we need to remain curious in those senses as well. Yet, when it comes to if somebody's treating somebody poorly, you know that that's not the right way to treat somebody. Poorly is not written in the Bible. We shall treat people poorly. No, there's nothing that motivates us or commands us to treat people with hate, right? There's no greater love than Christian hate, right? So we need to be really careful about our curiosity and to engage in reflection. Something that we don't see fully, something that we don't understand in the wide picture, in the broader context, because that's how we remain humble, actually, is if we understand the larger context. So when I look at the world today and I see what's going on and what's happening in our government or even in our local context, why are people behaving the way that they are? Well, if I was fed one thread of information, like I am many times, I'm offered a thread of information, and that becomes my myopic perspective, right? I can understand why people are responding the way that they are, and why this set of people over here receiving this myopic perspective is reacting the way that they are. But could you imagine a world where we remain maybe a little more open and a little more wider in our certainty? Like our certainty is not so black and white, that there's a lot of gray in what we are seeing and believing and witnessing. I think that when we cross over the line of surety or certainty, we've cashed in our faith. So a broader look is, well, maybe my faith can grow a little bit in my curiosity. Maybe my faith can grow a little bit in my widening of maybe the reflection of what I am seeing. Maybe we don't see it fully. And if we don't see it fully, we many times when we do see it more fully, we're like, wow, I didn't understand that. Wow, I didn't realize that. And sometimes we broaden our view of, well, maybe there's a few more, like, for example, authoritarian leaders in this world than I realized that there were. Maybe this populist type behavior is wider, broader, more popular than I thought it was. Maybe the dangerous idea of threatening democracy is happening in more places than just here. And so then I start gaining a perspective. Well, maybe this is happening in more places than just mine. And I can remain curious of what is the result of that over here, or what is happening over here because of what I see I'm experiencing here in my homeland. So when I look at now people, and I see just people, and I'm not dehumanizing them, I'm looking them as human beings, and I'm seeing that human being as a person that has emotional makeup. They've been raised a certain way. They've engaged in life a certain way, and they have all the hurts and the habits and the hangups that they have, just like I have all the hurts and the habits and the hangups that I have. And we're entering into this world as maybe just we're incomplete talkers. We don't have everything right. Our minds are different in different ways, right? Maybe if I look at someone as just they're doing the very best that they can with what they've been given. And I really believe that, and I engage in that sentence. Everyone is doing the very best that they can with what they've been given. Some people need to stop doing that. Yes, I agree with that. But they're actually doing the best, and what they're doing is not good. I get that. But everyone is doing the very best that they can with what they've been given. That's a practice of compassion. So when we actually practice compassion, when our systems are stressed, we reduce people to categories, then the opposite happens, calling us back to a personalized relationship with somebody. We can I say rehumanize? We rehumanize an individual over dehumanizing an individual. So we engage our compassion. So in our movement, we pause, we remain very curious, and then we definitely practice rehumanization. We practice compassion. So take an individual that says something, and maybe it's a parent, maybe it's a relative, maybe it's somebody that you know, a best friend, somebody says something to you. You love this person deeply, and all of a sudden they say something that is completely antithetical to your value system, who you are, what you believe in, and really the gospel of Christ, completely antithetical to the gospel of Christ. And you look at them and you go, okay, why did that person just say that? And you find out that they've been trapped into this silo of algorithm of information, that they're just receiving one side of things. And then you broaden that perspective and say, well, maybe I can have compassion in this situation. Maybe I can have compassion in this conversation. So Micah telling me to act justly, to love mercy, and to walk humbly, to act, to do justice. We do justice, and we love mercy, right? God does not tell us to love justice, right? He tells us to love mercy. If I love justice, I'm going to dehumanize that person and put them in that place, and I'm going to separate from them because what they said is completely different than what I believe, and I don't need to be around that kind of stuff. But when I love mercy, I look at that person and go, well, maybe mercy, I need to give that person a second chance. Maybe they need a do-over. Maybe I can ask them questions about why they believe the way that they do. Maybe then, if I'm curious, maybe I can offer a different perspective, or maybe I can offer a different type of information that they've never heard before. So mercy without humility, in the opposite of that, just becomes self-righteousness, and self-righteousness, it does not allow relationships to flourish. But in order to do all of this, in order to actually engage in relationships this way, I definitely personally need to be grounded, and I need to be grounded in the present. A lot of our anxiety is caused of future, like unsurety, right? And much of our anger is caused by past. So our anxiety is future and our anger is past. But transformation happens in the present, and it happens in community. It happens in relationship. And when I can remain curious in relationships and ask better questions, and I can get to the bottom of what's happening, and maybe that person is hurt and they're speaking out of their hurt. Maybe that person is angry over something that I don't know about. Maybe it's a relational thing that they're dealing with, because I couldn't imagine my best friend, all of a sudden I'm engaged in relationship with them and we're getting along and everything's good, and out of the blue some political conversation happens and our relationship is destroyed. How is that possible? That is only possible when we don't have mercy, we don't have humility, and we are just loving justice, and you're wrong and I am right, and split happens. Transformation can happen in those relationships. We can be transformed by renewing our mind in those relationships. So Jesus always brings us back to the now, back to the present. What am I doing in this current present life? Am I grounded in the present? Remember, anxiety is future-based, anger usually, and anger is past-based usually, but transformation happens in the present. So how do I practice that in tangible ways? We need to practice connection even across difference. We need to practice connection even across difference. And this is hard. Here's where I want to widen our lens a little bit, because resilience is not built on just connection with everyone who just thinks and believes the same. Resilience is communal, and it is communal in difference. So if you look across, let's just take religious traditions, for example. Let's just name them: Christian, Jewish, Muslim, Buddhist, Hindu, Sikh. There's quite a few religious traditions out there. And then there's nuances of all of those religious traditions as well. So there's different, I guess, practices and traditions amongst those, let's say, those main traditions. And in those main traditions, can we practice resilience in conversation with people that we just don't necessarily believe in the same things? Can we practice resilience in that difference? Because we do have shared practices across all of those traditions that I just named, plus all the rest of them: stillness, prayer, compassion, mercy, awareness, humility. All of those practices are shared tradition. So truth is never threatened by dialogue. Truth is never threatened by dialogue. Faith is not weakened by dialogue and listening. Faith is not weakened by listening to somebody that let's say, you don't agree with, right? Faith is weakened when we combat people that we disagree with. Faith is strengthened when we actually love and care and have compassion and mercy with people that we are in disagreement with. So could you imagine how much greater our resilience would be, and how much stronger of a community, a people, a person I would be if I would strengthen my resilience through loving those, and as I stay grounded maybe in my conviction, like I have certain convictions, but remaining open in my posture, that my posture would totally be open to sit down and have a meal and share with others of all kinds of difference. If I can imagine for a moment being deeply rooted and deeply open at the same time. And that deep rootedness and that deep openness at the same time grows our resilience. It grows our faith. Deeply rooted and completely closed actually weakens our faith. It weakens who we are as a people. It weakens our prayers. It weakens our compassion. It weakens our mercy. It weakens our humility. It closes our awareness, and it gyrates our our stillness. And so the sitting and knowing that God is God and you are you and you're comfortable with who you are in your own skin, and somebody comes along and they're saying something that maybe politically that you completely disagree with, could we sit in stillness and pause for a moment, developing our curiosity, widening our lens, trying to understand where this person is coming from, and still remain rooted in our conviction, still remaining rooted in what we believe, but deeply open to them as a person, because they are a human being. Could we imagine a life where we again treat human beings as human beings? So when I think about Jesus, Jesus lived in that tension. Jesus lived in that religious division and political divisiveness and pressure and cultural conflict. Jesus lived in that kind of place and lived amongst a group that didn't like certain things about other groups, and still met the woman at the well, still walked up to the prostitute, still had dined with notorious sinners, still called out as hospitality, called to hospitality, the tax collector, called to hospitality with a tax collector, with notorious sinners, with a woman in public, with a prostitute in public, with a Samaritan woman in public. Could you imagine in this life that we call people to hospitality versus hate? Could you imagine calling people to that present, relational, grounded place? We call people to that because it's the right thing to do. It's the Jesus model. It's the gospel. So instead of calling people names or lunatics or dumb or stupid or whatever's coming from our leadership, could we actually live in the kingdom idea that we call people of difference to the table? Because if they're not welcome to the table, I'm not welcome to the table, right? And so we need to really admit and confess that living in that tension has dysregulated our systems. And if we could step out of that tension and be different and sit with a Muslim at the table. I mean, we are so like right now in our political landscape, so once again, against in our culture wide, right? We're once again nationally against an Islamic regime. Again, we're against this Islamic political system. And so what has that created? That has created, again, Islamophobia and Islamic hate. So could you imagine, as you're listening to that news cycle, that you sit down with a person that is Islamic and you have a meal with that person, maybe share in the breaking of the fast, where you're just learning and maybe even about their religion and why they believe what they believe, and sitting there like humanizing and fighting for humanization, fighting for compassion, fighting for mercy, and fighting for love. Could you imagine the transformation process that you would go through because of that? You would embody different things much differently. You would listen to that news cycle and you would say, I don't need to embody that kind of hate, right? So when it says on earth as it is in heaven, that the word again became flesh and made a dwelling amongst us, full of grace and full of compassion. When I read that, I say, okay, that's not just some truth. That's not just some cute statement. I myself am an embodiment of Christ himself. And how did Christ act in that? Reached across political lines, reached across religious lines, reached across cultural lines, reached across even moral, like what he or they, whoever they were, thought was morally right or wrong, reached across to the quote unclean and brought them to the table and practiced compassion and love and grace and mercy and kingdom behavior on earth as it is in heaven. That's resilience. That's acting in resilience. stoving up in our caves and enclaves of truth and what we believe is right versus what you crazy people think are wrong, right? That's not resilience. That's the weakening of our faith. That's fear. That's reaction. That's division. But this is a slower path. This is a graceful path. This is a merciful path. This is the fruit of the Spirit, a life at peace, goodness, faithfulness, treating people with gentleness and kindness, with our response within ourselves, self-control, and then the expression of love. Thanks for listening today. I hope you got something out of that.